All right, guys. I think I'm recording now. I just wanted to say hi. Welcome to the English 102 discussion, or my WebTeach on Amy Tan's A Pair of Tickets and Mukherjee's. My mind is drawing a blank. Mukherjee's The Management of Grief. So those of you who came to the class meeting yesterday, I showed you kind of a brief image on my whiteboard of what I was going to be talking about today. So I'm going to be elaborating on those images, and I actually added something, so it'll be helpful for you to watch this. So I'm going to, as I normally do, I'm going to turn the volume up first. Hopefully that'll help you to hear me better. I'm going to point the camera toward the whiteboard and then essentially explain some of the things that are going on in the text. A lot of these are going to be comparison and contrast because there are a lot of similarities going on in these texts, even though they're two very different stories. So I would like for you to focus on that, but then we'll also be talking about other things that pertain to each text individually. Okay, so I'm just going to turn the screen toward the whiteboard, extreme close-up here, so that you have it. How do I do that? Okay, perfect. All right, so the first one is I've created, as you can see here, I've created 3 different Venn diagrams in relation to the stories. These should help you not only understand them in terms of a comparison and contrast, but to understand them individually. So the first one is the concept of death and loss, right? Both of these stories deal with those concepts. And so it might help you if in your notes, you can kind of create this little Venn diagram of death and loss and see what connections you're making, what similarities they have in terms of dealing with the notion of death and loss, and what differences they have. I know I should have only drawn 2 circles, but I just made it look like a typical Venn diagram. If you want to maybe incorporate a third story from your own experience or something you've read that makes you think about this, that might be a fun exercise too. So maybe Venn diagram, or maybe just sort of that, that compare and contrast chart where you can do those sorts of listing, however you want to do it. The next one, and I really wanted to do these as 2 separate categories, but I just don't have space on this tiny whiteboard, are travel and immigration, and how they're dealt with, again, similarly and differently. One story more so than the other, and again, I'm not going to give anything away, but one story more so than the other, travel is directly related to the idea of immigration. Actually in both stories, but in one, it's kind of the whole plot, right? It's part of the whole plot, the whole setting of the story, whereas the other one, it's kind of a secondary setting. So think about how travel and immigration are dealt with in these stories. And then the third one is family relationships. Kind of think about how family relationships are dealt with, and why that is significant or important, or maybe extra familial relationships, meaning relationships outside of the family, right? Maybe thinking about how people deal with their families, their cultural communities, and then people outside of their cultural communities. So maybe we can just change this one to like relationships, and we can do like that family, right? Family, community, and then sort of, sorry if my arm's in the way, like non-community, or even the larger culture, right? That might be a helpful Venn diagram for this one, is thinking about those relationships, how people deal with one another based on sort of where they lie within these social groups. So in terms of plot, I would recommend that you watch Dulce's video on the direction of plot. She uses a great example from the film Stand and Deliver. And there are also the class notes under the literary terms PowerPoint that address these things. The PowerPoint notes are slightly different in that they include two that are not mentioned in typical diagrams of this. So I'm going to kind of go over the seven steps that are in the literary terms. But again, watch Dulce's video on Teach the Class, on the Teach the Class discussion board, because that's really going to help you. It's really going to help to explain what all of these are and what they mean. The first one is exposition. And if you notice the root word of that, it's expose. And that's what we're doing. We're exposing the characters, the setting, the sort of background information that we need to know in order to move this story forward. And then right after we go through that exposition, we have a catalyzing event. And just like in biology, when you work with catalysts, right, they're sort of the thing that takes things out of balance or stasis, right? Kind of shifts the balance of the action into what becomes the rising action or a series of conflicts, okay? So we expose the characters, we have some sort of event the catalyzing event that puts everything in motion, leading us toward the climax. So that rising action, those series of conflicts are gonna lead us to the climax, which is sort of the main issue, the main event, the main conflict, sometimes even the main epiphany or the main epiphanic moment that happens within a play or a short story. And then once that occurs, the climax is also kind of considered the point from which we can't go back, right? The point of no return. So once the climax occurs, then we have the falling action, right? Where things, again, say hello to my dogs. The falling action is where things, hey. The falling action occurs after the climax, where kind of we are having, you know, we're kind of not bouncing back necessarily in all stories, but, you know, the climax creates this falling action that's going to eventually lead to the ending of the story, right? So things have to be figured out, understood, maybe not figured out and done something with. But it's the action that occurs after the climax, which leads to traditionally what is called the resolution, when items are resolved in a story or a play. And sometimes they're not resolved, right? And that's the resolution in and of itself, is that things are not resolved. And that, you know, it sometimes comes at the very end, sometimes comes a few pages or paragraphs or what have you before the ending. But that's kind of the second to last piece. And the very final piece, which again is not mentioned in the class, in the typical sort of plot chart, is the denouement. It's a French word. It's essentially a reflection on the resolution. So what, if anything, is learned from this resolution, from this entire story, this entire series of events? It's, you know, if you think about it in terms of like a quote unquote conclusion, it's sort of like the lasting impression, right? So again, that word is denouement. It's a French word. I know it looks like it reads denouement, but it is not pronounced that way. So what I would say to do in terms of plot is think about these two stories and think about how the plot moves. Think about all of these various stages in the plot of both stories, right? They're clearly different for either story, but think about how that moves and what that looks like. You may even in your notes want to chart this for the, you know, to make two charts for each story to see kind of what happens. And it wouldn't hurt, especially for SA2, to maybe go back to the play Sarah Kane's Blasted and make this same sort of chart for that, because that might help clarify some of the things you might want to talk about in your essay. So it's you know, you can do a really quick note-taking strategy for this. just draw that little chart and then fill in the blanks. I recommend that you do that. And for Climax here, I'm just going to put another little, I don't know why that just was bothering me. Finally, going back to the short stories. We've talked, and again, I believe it's Evelyn and David who did protagonist and antagonist, if I'm not mistaken. Again, check out their Teach the classes on protagonist and antagonist, because those are going to be incredibly helpful in terms of understanding what these terms mean. Also look at the class notes on literary terms starting at slide 17, because this is where all this kind of begins. But in terms of these stories, right, one of the things I say in the class notes is that, you know, when we traditionally think of protagonist and antagonist, we're thinking in terms of like the good guy and the bad guy. And that's not necessarily what they mean. Oftentimes it's not what they mean at all. The protagonist being sort of the person around whom, or the character, I should say, because sometimes it's like an animal or something, right? Like in George Orwell's Animal Farm. The character around whom the majority of the action is influenced by or influences. So not necessarily a hero. Think Walter White in Breaking Bad. The antagonist is the character then who most challenges a protagonist within a given play or story or narrative. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a person. And so what I would say for these two short stories is, if we know that the antagonist is the sort of force or the entity or the character that pushes against the protagonist, that challenges the protagonist, that creates problems for the protagonist, my question to you is, in Tan's A Pair of Tickets, in Mukherjee's The Management of Grief, who or what is the antagonist? And really thinking about that, right? Thinking about how an antagonist isn't even always a character. Who or what could be the antagonist in this case? I mean, sometimes it is, there's definitely an argument in both of those stories where the antagonist is a character. But I think an argument can also be made for it to just be essentially like an abstract entity, right? So those are the notes for the readings. That's my lesson plan for the readings. I do want to address in these final moments a couple more things.